thanks, Kevin, for this really nice introduction to environmental governance in Arctic environments. I'll try to pick up on that by talking a bit about whether I think the large herbivores could potentially play a role in stabilizing carbon in ecosystems, with a focus on Arctic systems, of course. Okay, let's see if I can also make this. Oh, there you go. Yeah, so I'll start off with a slide introducing rewilding, the concept of rewilding. For those of you who may not be familiar with this concept, it is basically just an idea of sort of restoring ecosystems back to a self-regulating state where they can, where they don't need sort of external human maintenance or input to be self-sustained. There's different versions of it, but one that is often mentioned is one with where large animals play a prominent role, because they often are found to play very significant functional roles in ecosystems. One of the things that is often being mentioned as one of the outcomes, potential outcomes of rewilding, except for biodiversity gains or protection and increase the resilience maybe, is also carbon sequestration. So there are a lot of claims about rewilding being a good strategy to also get nature-based climate solutions, although it is largely, or to a large degree, untested. But that was sort of my motivation for going into this whole rewilding field. One of the more famous rewilding experiments in the world is this Pleistocene park up in northeastern Siberia. So these are just some images from their Facebook from the last couple of weeks, and basically, yeah, so it basically shows an expedition that they recently undertook, and they do this like every now and again when they want to introduce new animals to the park. So it's sort of an ongoing thing that they add new animals every now and again, and this year it was camels and goats. So yeah, it's very it's a very intriguing project they have up there, and the guy you see there in the middle is Nikita Simov, so he's the one sort of running it these days. Started by his father Sergei back in the days. Well, the basic idea is, so if you look at the top right panel there, you see what the Simovs and others have imagined that the Beringian mammoth steppe ecosystem looked like. So this very herbivore-rich or animal-rich system that was also quite productive, a grassland system basically. But this is what it has turned into, what it has become today. Still incredibly beautiful, as I'm sure we all share the love for this region of the world, but also relatively low it's not very productive or fertile. So the idea was that they wanted to test whether they could swap it back into this ecosystem state where it's more highly productive and more dominated by herbs. And they wanted to do this for several reasons. One being climate mitigation, because there are some benefits to having large animals in systems in the north, and one is the effect on albedo, because when you have the animals, yeah. So this schematic here is basically showing three northern ecosystem. One is the northern taiga, one is the forest tundra egatone, and one is then the open tundra ecosystem. And it's supposed to show that in the front you have the ecosystems with herbivores, and in the back without herbivores, and then to the left is the summer conditions, and to the right in each sub panel is the winter conditions. So what you see is that during the summer you have, or during both summer and winter, you have actually higher albedos. During the summer, because you have this lighter herbaceous surface compared to the dwarf shrubs, and during the winter, it's because you don't have these shrubs peeking through the snow as you do have without the herbivores. So you do have an increase in albedo, less energy absorbed by the system when you have the herbivores in. And another effect is that you also densify. You make the snowpack denser, and you also make it thinner, which in combination means that you get lower soil temperatures. So both these things are good news if you're a piece of permafrost lying down there under the snow and you want to stay like that. Thinking in biogeochemical cycling terms, you can this is one way of depicting it. And yeah, so you can build different types of hypotheses of what may happen when you introduce large animals to the system. One thing being that you diversify the above ground vegetation, you increase the inputs of more easily available substrates, not least due to this pathway, so through urine and dung into the system. And these things in combination makes the carbon and nutrient turnover accelerate in the soil. Further, many of these herbivore adapted plant species tend to have higher below ground allocation of carbon compared to their woody alternatives. And then finally, there's this process of soil mixing or soil structuring by the herbivores, but also the associated organisms. How important this is in the Arctic is not very clear, but at least something to consider. And all these things in combination may, in different ways, stabilize soil organic matter, and hence ecosystem carbon. So there are some context dependencies that are worth mentioning, because as soil scientists, we often think about like what limits decomposition in the soil, and there are different options here. In these high latitude cold systems, it's often temperature. It can also be oxygen in wetter parts. These are probably the two most well-known carbon stores in the soils, the wetlands and the permafrost regions. There are also other options. So grasslands also tend to have very high carbon stocks, but that's due to different processes. So chemical protection and physical protection due to aggregation or complexation with the mineral soil. And then finally, substrate availability can also hamper the decomposition. But basically, this results in very different pools of carbon in the soil. So in these systems where you still have a buildup of carbon, it tends to be this it tends to be dominated by particulate organic matter, or POM, which is more vulnerable to decomposition or any type of perturbations. Could also be fire, for instance, which is increasing in wetlands all over the place. Whereas in these other systems, it tends to be more dominated. The legacy carbon, the old carbon, tends to be more dominated by the mineral associated forms. So the big question is, how will megafauna then change these limiting factors, right? If we forget about these three for a moment and just focus on this one, the temperature limitation, then that's what we already talked about. So that's the direct effects that the herbivores have on the soil temperature and the preservation of the permafrost. And that is maybe the dimension that is most well understood at this point. But is it really important what goes on in the Arctic? Well, I guess we all know, we have seen something similar to this, right? So the vast majority of carbon in our ecosystem, terrestrial ecosystems at least, is stored at high latitudes, and particularly in the soil. So yes, it is worth considering how we may preserve that, how we may keep that in the ground to not enter any undesirable feedback loops with the climate. Okay, so moving on to these other types of protection against decomposition in the soil. There has been an increasing number of papers coming out in very, very good journals in recent years, suggesting that if we want to store carbon on climate relevant timescales, we cannot keep just focusing on the size of the carbon stocks in the ecosystems. We need to also consider how resistant is carbon in different pools to perturbations. And there seems to be this continuum. So the above ground biomass being the least the least resistant type of carbon in the system, all the way down to this mineral associated soil organic carbon. So if we can somehow make an argument stating that herbivores may be able to shift carbon between these pools towards more persistent pools, then we might have a good case for at least testing whether herbivores may be able to stabilize ecosystem carbon. So first we can take a look at what it usually looks like in sort of an idealized grassland and forest ecosystem. Although the absolute stocks, soil carbon stocks, may be quite similar in these types of systems, you can see that in the grassland systems, it tends to be more dominated by, that's all the solid lines here, tend to be more dominated by the mineral associated organic matter rather than the particulate organic matter. So the more stable fraction of soil carbon, and as, which is probably more intuitive, is that you have a higher fraction of the ecosystem carbon stored above ground in forest ecosystems compared to grassland system, which makes it even more vulnerable in the forests, or in woody dominated systems, I should probably say. So there are at least three ways that we could think of herbivores increasing the stability of carbon in soils. One being increasing the below-ground C-allocation, one being increasing soil mixing, so the exposure of organic matter in the soil to mineral complexation or aggregate formation. And then finally, a shift in ecosystem metabolism, so a shift in carbon use efficiency of the soil microbes or the decomposer community in general. So if we start with the below ground carbon allocation, there has been quite a few studies coming out in recent years suggesting that grassland systems have the highest proportional below ground C allocation, that this allocation is at least in some cases enhanced by grazing, and that root associated microbes is a very sort of large fraction of the stable organic carbon. And then that grass roots and their associated microbes are actually actively forming soil aggregates. So yes, there is some evidence to suggest that this might be one pathway that should be investigated. What about soil mixing then? So this is a schematic that I made recently for a paper that we hope to submit soon. But it basically shows that even though large herbivores may have an impact on soil mixing, it tends to be a lot smaller than the other animals that are usually associated with large animals. So a lot of soil macrofauna, a lot of fossorial mammals like prairie dogs or moles are often found in herbivore-rich systems. And they are very, very effective soil mixes. So you could have sort of an indirect effect of large herbivores on soil bioturbation. And if we look at first the direct effects, there has been some studies on the effect of wild boar bioturbation. And basically what you see, even though they do not have any sort of short-term effects on the net soil carbon stocks, they do increase they do shift soil organic matter towards the more stable fractions in the soil, the mineral associated fraction. And then there's the mixing by other animals. That was recently shown to be ubiquitous. Basically, there are soil mixing organisms in more or less all systems, although many of these species tend to be associated with open habitats, particularly, and some directly with megafauna because they live off of their substrates. But this one deserves its own slide because this one is a particularly effective bioturbator, and this one is very, very good at mixing particulate organic matter into the subsoil surface and make it complexate with or make it stabilize with mineral soil. And interestingly, from an herbivore perspective, they tend to be in much higher densities when you have herbivores present in the system. So yeah, there's also some evidence to go out and test whether herbivores could increase the soil mixing. And then the third one is, which is ecosystem metabolism or carbon use efficiency. So that's basically the whole rationale behind the Pleistocene part. That was this idea of shifting the whole system back to a more productive herb-dominated system. And there was this seminal paper by Van der Waal in OUPF from 2006 that very nicely showed that there is, particularly from the Arctic, quite a bit of evidence showing that actually instead of enhancing the low productivity systems becoming less productive and the high productivity systems becoming more productive, which was sort of the existing framework, you actually often see this state transition towards these gramenite dominated systems, even the low productivity Arctic areas, which also means higher plant productivity usually. But more interestingly, from a soil microbial carbon use efficiency perspective, we can see that grassland systems tend to have higher carbon use efficiency on average than woody dominated systems. And one potential mechanism for this is that we know that availability of easily decomposable or easily degradable substrates such as glucose increase carbon use efficiency, and that seems to be, or that is very often associated with rhizosphere soils of grassland systems or similar. So yes, although it is not a huge amount of evidence on it, there is some reason to believe that there might also be this increase in carbon use efficiency when you shift over to herbivore dominated systems, which basically means that there's so much of the stable organic matter in soils comes from necromass of soil microbes. So that's why this is interesting, how much they allocate to growth rather than respiration. And then just a final slide on my project, Herbivore, which will then focus on these three attributes. So ecosystem metabolism, soil organic carbon persistence in different pools, and then I will also look at how try to establish a link, the faunal link, or the below ground community link between what the herbivores do and what we see in the different soil pools by getting estimates of soil fauna and microbial communities. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Jeppe. That was great. So yeah, as before, I'd like to invite questions. So please raise your hand or drop a question in the chat. I would also like to ask a question. So I'll jump in first. And Jeppe, I was wondering about this thing of herbivores coming in and sort of thinning out the tree cover somewhat. And I think you presented a slide that showed that the impact should be to stabilize permafrost. Was that correct?
Yes.
And I think that makes sense, certainly during the winter time, because the trampled snow means that the cold atmosphere can cool down the ground more efficiently because it will conduct heat better. And I was wondering about the summertime, because on the other hand, during the summer season, trees are going to shade the ground, and there's some evapotranspiration, which is also going to cool the ground through the latent heat upon evaporation. But maybe you also get that with grass too. I don't know. So is there a summer effect that kind of counters the winter stabilization, or is that simply less important?
I think I might actually have a slide somewhere here that shows that in a graph, or maybe I don't have it anymore. Well, anyways, yeah. So you're right. You can measure that there is a slightly higher, at least in the beginning, a slightly higher summer temperature, at least in the topsoil, when you have the herbivores there. But as you also suggest yourself, like with time, the grass vegetation will actually also increase in height. So there's also a shedding effect there. However, this slight increase in summer temperature does not seem to have any sort of prominent effect on the active layer depth, and at least the cooling during the winter is much more important in terms of refreezing and preserving the permafrost. So yeah, you're right in terms of mechanisms, but from what it's not well studied, right? But from what we know so far, I think the best reference for that is the Beer et al. 2020 paper in Scientific Reports that showed that modeled this. I'm happy to send it in the chat. But
I think Maria may have even just linked that paper.
No, sorry, different paper.
But same idea. Anyway, good to know that that the winter effect is what dominates there. Thanks, Jeppe, for your answer, and Maria for the paper. Okay, anyone else got a question to ask? Well, I might go again then. I think that, oh, Matilda has a question, I think. Or she's saying yes to something anyway. She can't raise her hand. Go ahead, Matilda. Can you unmute?
Hi everyone. Sorry, yes, I don't know, my functionality is somewhat diminished. Thank you very much for that talk, Jeppe. Really, really interesting for someone who knows nothing about ecosystem things. I had just one question, and that is how much could herded reindeer kind of perform these, I guess, ecosystem services or processes that you've been talking about? Thank you.
So if Mark is still on board, he's actually the right person to answer that question, because he had a paper on that in the transaction or philosophical transaction of the Royal Society from last year, where they actually tried to determine what is the upscaling potential of this, right? Across the Arctic, and I must be honest, I don't recall the numbers here, but if Mark is here, maybe he can just jump in case he remembers. Is he still here? Or maybe not. He used to be here. He was here earlier. But anyways, yeah. So I don't recall the numbers, but I'm happy to send it over again, that paper as well. But at least it is, you know, you might think that it seems that the largest constraint actually might be, well, there's tons of them, of course, but if you only look from an ecological perspective, it might actually be the reproduction rate of these large animals, because actually if you want to scale this up real quick, you know, talking about this is totally ignoring any sort of you know, governmental or governance constraint, because that's obviously will be, I guess, the largest constraint. But if we only think about biological process, then I think one of the conclusions of that paper was that it will be extremely challenging to just get enough animals, basically.
Oh, Mark has raised his hand.
Hi. Sorry, I might have missed part of the discussion. I just got a phone call from Jamal just at the moment in which Jeppe stopped talking. So I have the suspicion that perhaps there has been some things in the questions that I could have talked about, especially regarding Pleistocene Park. So if that is the case, just ask again or say it again if you were asking for anything or any feedback or comment on that. But I had a question for you, Jeppe. I don't know if others have asked it, but it looked like you were hinting at a relationship between having more megafauna and having more small bioturbators, since the small bioturbators are the ones that are really making the bigger impact on this soil mixing. I wondered if is this just a correlation that has been shown, or is there some sort of a known mechanisms that could, you know, that could link the abundance of megafauna with the abundance of smaller bioturbators? That's a question.
Yeah, so there are two, right? Thanks for that question, Mark. There's two potential mechanisms which also was on that figure, and one is habitat creation, basically. So you know, there's a lot of these that basically these animals that are dependent on, you know, energy coming down, reaching the surface. So like these opening up of the landscape is important, but also some of them are directly feeding on the excreta from the animals, basically, right? And also the changes in vegetation community also tend to favor some of these animals, right? However, I think it is very important to note that this is probably, this is my expectation at least, that this is probably much more important in other places than in the Arctic for two reasons. One being that we have cryotubation in at least the permafrost regions, so which basically performs the same mixing. So this exposure of organic matter to mineral surfaces is not something that we lack in these systems. It is in other systems, but not in these particular systems. That's one thing, and the other reason is a more interesting one from a rewilding perspective, which is that you know, if we just introduce, there's this sort of implicit assumption always in rewilding in rewilding projects, that is that if we just introduce large sort of key species, then all the rest will sort of migrate or disperse to there from like biogeographical islands that are sort of always assumed to be there, including soil fauna, right? Soil microbes probably not so much of a problem because they can disperse through air and stuff and over very long distances. But soil fauna certainly not. So you'd have to wait probably. You know, I think there was a review recently a couple of years ago of earthworm distributions, for instance, in a global review, and it was like I think 3,000 kilometers to the nearest earthworm or something like that from Pleistocene Park, for instance, right? And there's no reason not to believe that earthworms were an incredibly important part of this mammoth steppe ecosystem. So I think we should consider, if we can establish some of these relationships and understand them better, then we ought to consider multi-trophic rewilding, or like rewilding at multiple trophic levels, rather than just thinking that as long as we restore the herbivore community, everything else will just sort of come by itself. But it's more of a, you know, I don't know, yeah, rewilding answer, I guess.
Thanks. Yeah, I remember that paper. The dispersal of earthworms in the Arctic was very much linked with gardening in the cities of the Arctic. But other than that, yeah, dispersal was very slow outside of these urban places. Thanks. And good to see you, Kevin, as well, since I have a voice. Good to see you there. And thanks for your talk too.
Nice to see you too, Mark.
So in case we have more time, but that's I guess we don't really. But Mark, there was a question to you, which was what is the upscaling potential of this whole thing, right? And you're
yeah,
the right one to answer that.
Yeah, I knew I might have been missing out on something during that call. It's the key question. I'm not going to go too deep on that. We made some conservative estimates, and the main limiting factor was the number of animals that should be required on a yearly basis to basically change big chunks of the Arctic. If all the other things, such as willingness of the inhabitants to have that thing changed, to start with, and the whole mechanism really working, if all that could be a given, then we would be short of animals if we want to transform, let's say, 1 million square kilometers of shrubby tundra in the most organic rich permafrost into grassland. That being said, after we published the paper, I got some emails from bison farms in Alaska telling us that the estimates of growth of the population that we had used were lower than their experience. So there might be a correction upwards into the ability of actually having those animals. But yeah, the biggest scalability issue is basically having enough large animals. And this is basically because we have a time frame over which this could happen, right? Which is the next 30 years or so, because that's when in a way that permafrost can be protected. Otherwise, it will collapse anyway. And it's still a good idea, as there was a recent paper on in general nature-based solutions a month ago, basically saying that nature-based solutions are something to think much more in the longer term than in the short-term impact studies. So it would still be a good idea, but it couldn't fully answer this sort of permafrost protection that is required in the next few decades. So scalability is, I wouldn't say no go, but the limitation number one definitely that needs further studies on that. Yeah.